Iran is a nation that has existed in some capacity for thousands of years, and throughout history it has gone through many highs and many lows. The 19th century was one of these lows. Iran would lose land to other powers, the treasury would remain perpetually empty, its army became outdated and weak, and while it would not be colonized, the great game between the British and the Russians meant that it effectively had no sovereignty. There was a brief period, however, where Iran had hope. When he first became ruler, Nasir al-Din Shah Qajar appointed Mirza Taqi Khan Farahani, or better known as Amir Kabir, as his chief minister to help reform and fix the country. His term lasted for only 3 years, but in that time, he did more to try to rebuild Iran than anyone else. Amir Kabir started his career in the bureaucracy as a military registrar for the army in Azerbaijan, with more promotions making him responsible for the army's finances, organization and provisions. During his tenure, he also travelled to Russia and the Ottoman Empire, where he observed their institutions and reforms, taking a lot of inspiration. These foreign missions probably influenced his beliefs about the need to reform Iran. He was chief tutor to the Crown Prince Nasir al-Din, and when he became the new ruler, Amir Kabir, who was trusted and also brother-in-law to the king, became chief minister. He started his tenure with Iran in deep trouble. The treasury was empty, the state had no authority, and the Russians and the British were gaining more and more influence in the country. The first priority was to stabilize the nation by putting down all revolts and cementing the authority of the state. Once that was done, fixing state finances were next. The salaries of many civil servants as well as expenses were cut and many perks and privileges were reduced. The government tried to centralize tax collection through removing tax farmers and started demanding provinces and tribal chiefs to pay all overdue taxes. Public lands that were lying dormant were brought under cultivation, and a greater focus was put on making these lands more commercially profitable. Amir Kabir also set up a tariff to discourage the purchase of foreign goods and set up factories in different cities. Sugar was planted for export, while cotton was grown in Tehran and the Urmia region. The government also built canals, bazaars, and even a dam in the Khuzestan region. He also set up the Darul Fanoon, an educational institute whose purpose was to train civil servants and officers with modern knowledge. Its staff largely consisted of Austrian instructors, and it would later be turned into the University of Tehran. Amir Kabir also changed Iran's foreign policy from being conciliatory to keeping both powers at arm's length and not allowing anyone to gain influence. Rebuilding Iran's army was also a priority, as in his 3 years in charge, the budget and the size of the army increased. Efforts were made to modernize the army, but progress was slow, and Amir Kabir's successors didn't build on his work. His efforts at centralizing control also resulted in the suppression of the followers of Babism, a relatively new faith which was causing trouble for the government. Several of their members were killed, and even their founder, the Bab, was executed under Amir Kabir's orders. By observing the Tanzimat reforms in the Ottoman Empire, Amir Kabir believed that the influence of religion in Iran has to be reduced. The clergy in Iran had significant influence that challenged the state's authority, and while he did reduce some of it, he eventually ran out of time. Why did he run out of time, I hear you ask? Well, look back at the video. All of Amir Kabir's policies, while good for Iran, reduced the power of one group or the other. His appointment was opposed by the king's mother as well as senior members of the bureaucracy who had loyalty to other powers. His austerity policies alienated government employees and even the royal family, including the king, who saw their privileges cut. Implementing tariffs angered the British, and trying to reduce Russian commercial operations wasn't taken well either. The provincial governors as well as the tribal chiefs didn't like paying taxes, while the clergy wanted to keep their influence. Usually, when you try to reform a system, you want to have at least some core base of support that you can fall back on. Amir Kabir believed that the king would support him and protect him from the opposition.
It's time to go!
But in the end, it was the king who, under the influence of his mother, removed him. He was dismissed in 1851 and sent to Kashan. Only a couple of weeks later, he was executed. With his death, also died Iran's chance of reforming itself and re-establishing itself as a great power.